Yeah, hello to all of you out there. We can't see you, but we're glad you're here. Um, I think, wait, I think I have to say continue or something. Yeah. I think we can say that plastic pollution has almost become a pop culture topic in the past years. Definitely, it's all over the media these days, and it has even created memes and characters like this plastic bag monster I met here on Tempelhofer Feld in Berlin, where I live. My role has been reporting on plastic pollution in the radio and as a host of the Plastisphere podcast. So I'm part of that media system. And I've been doing that for about 10 years on and off. And while I did that, I didn't only learn about plastic pollution, I also learned about how the media system works at the same time. And I'd like to share some insights with you, and I hope that'll give you some food for thought. My own background is in cultural sciences, so I'm not a natural scientist. I come from an interdisciplinary background of humanities and social sciences. And before I went into environmental reporting, I actually worked for a German radio show on internet culture and technology. So that was a media show. Oops, I guess I can't do the next one. So first, I want to do a little poll with you. Try to remember when you first learned about plastic pollution. I'd like to find out how long ago that was for you. Was it less than 1 year ago, 3 years ago, 10 years ago, 30 years ago, or I always knew about it? So cast your vote now. Let's see if there are any results. 10 years ago. That's pretty much like me. Okay, do we have 1 year? No, we don't have any newbies to the topic. 3 years ago is the second most. And then, wow, some people always knew about it. Some people are have been following this forever. I'd like to meet you. So I like to tell you how I learned about the topic. It was in 2009 when I read this article here via Twitter from The Independent, the world's rubbish dump, a tip that stretches from Hawaii to Japan. And this shows these accumulation zones in the Pacific Ocean. And that really gave me pause. I don't know, I guess it was just the thought that the remnants of our consumer culture end up in the middle of the ocean in a place that I never had even thought about. And in this article doesn't talk about plastic islands, which we often heard about as this myth. And I was curious, was my first article actually mentioned that? But it didn't. It already talks about a plastic soup. And it quotes the two men you see on the right, Charles Moore, the famous sea captain, you all probably know him, who in 1997 went through crossed this area between Hawaii and California and noticed the trash, and then really started to work on it with his organization Algalita. And down on the lower right, you see Marcus Ericsson, who was working with Charles Moore at the time, and he's also quoted in that article. And he later, together with his partner Anna Cummins, started an organization, Five Gyres, and I think all three of them have been extremely important when it comes to raising attention to the issue. The next thing I did was I went to the cinema and I watched this documentary movie. And as you can see, it has a pretty strong claim. Plastic Planet, you'll never dare to drink from a plastic bottle again. I think for me, it took another 2 years until I actually never drank or tried to not drink from a plastic bottle again. Yeah, that's by Werner Bothe. Some of you might have watched it. He's an Austrian filmmaker, and he also travels around the world. I read that this film had been 10 years in the making, and he's on a boat with Charles Moore, and he even visits the plastinator, who's like plastinating dead bodies. So like a completely wild association, I thought, and you know, somehow suggesting that we're all plastinating ourselves. And I remember leaving the cinema in bright daylight and thinking, is that all really the case. And because I was a journalist, I had a really good excuse, of course, to do some research. And eventually in 2011, that led me to this beach on the big island of Hawaii. It's called Camilo Beach, and it's quite iconic in the media as well, because it's one of the places where a lot of the trash from the so-called Great Pacific Garbage Patch comes to shore when the currents come down to that area. And here you see that it's pretty clean because all these people are coming down regularly cleaning it up. And that's actually quite an effort to go down there, because it takes a couple of hours in a four-wheel drive down a really, really bumpy dirt road to get there. And so there I saw it. The kids were collecting the plastic in their plastic bags, and I was recording as much tape as I could with my plastic recording equipment. And yeah, here are some more pictures. What we saw, Megan Lamson in the middle, she's a marine biologist. She took us down there and she showed us on the upper left how you can filter the sand and then see, you know, how much smaller bits are in there. Up on top, you see the skeleton of a coral polyp that had attached to a plastic pipe that we found there. And then, you know, down there, the bottle caps, the bottles that, you know, were obviously in the water for a long time. And on the upper right, you see me interviewing pretty much exactly 10 years ago, Nikolai Maximenko, who's an oceanographer at the University of Hawaii. And he was modeling the way that currents take trash around the globe and accumulate it in the gyres. And at the time, it wasn't really known yet if there were actually several gyres. The data was just being collected. So I came home and with all my tape and impressions, and my editor said to me at the German radio, okay, that's nice, but tell me more about the extent of the problem. How much is really in there? And I found this one number here, and it said, it's very small, but here you can see it. Every year, 6.4 million tons of plastic are dumped into the ocean. And on this little smartphone app, you also see it. It's like a sustainability app. Every year, 6.4 billion tons of plastic, actually a little more. And this was really the figure that was around at the time in the German media. Here you see a couple of newspaper and online news clippings that quote this number. And what was interesting about it was that sometimes it was trash, so Müll, and sometimes it was Kunststoff, so plastic. And I mean, those are two different things. So I was wondering where that number came from, and it was attributed to the United Nations Environmental Program. So I went to their website, which you see on the upper left. And I think that page doesn't exist anymore. And that said, in 1997, the US Academy of Sciences estimated the total input of marine litter into the oceans worldwide at approximately 6.4 million tons per year. So there was this estimate, 1997, not super new, but seemed pretty recent. And it was litter, so probably more than just plastic. So I wanted to see the National Academy of Sciences source, of course. So I finally found it on Google Books. And then I was really surprised because it was actually, the source was from 1975 and the data was even older. So really old data, back when plastics weren't produced as much as today. And on top of that, it was also just maritime sources, so just the trash that ships had thrown overboard, nothing from land. So it wasn't really a good figure. And so this whole story really made me think about whether there are other gyres as well, not only the ocean gyres where plastic trash or trash is circulating for a long time until finally it gets spit out one day, or there's also these citation or media gyres. And this here is a satirical visualization of the criticized relationship between Wikipedia and the press based on a 2008 graphic of the German satirical magazine Titanic. You know, the press just copies from Wikipedia, and then the Wikipedia just quotes from the press. And the words inside the circle are added by me because obviously the whole thing is more complicated. There are many more actors in this whole media gyre, but definitely I know they exist. Sometimes they get debunked, these figures from the gyres, from the media gyres. And in this case, this was very elegantly debunked already 5 years ago by Leo Hornak of BBC News. He made this really nice article where he asks, how do you measure the plastic and how do you count the fish to know that really by 2050 there could be more plastic in the ocean than fish? And he found that that's not really based on a scientific estimate. But still, it's like still in every presentation you see. So how do we get that out of the gyre? Can we have like a media gyre cleanup maybe? The other thing that has gotten really complicated, especially with social media, is images. One of these two images is a composite, and I'll give you a moment to think which one you think that is. And it's actually the one on the left. So that picture is not a real photograph. It's been composed by, I think, at least probably 3 to 4 images. And I actually found the upper and the lower part of the animal in different pictures. I haven't found the exact Q-tip, but yeah, that's definitely not real. And it was made by a Portuguese guy who has a marketing background, who made these images as artistic representations of what really happens out there. You know, this could be true. And as we see on the right hand, there are pictures that seem legit, that show marine animals interacting with Q-tips, but this is not real. And it becomes really hard to distinguish, even for an experienced editor at a news outlet. And I've seen that. So I think if we care about the facts, we really have to up our game. And I think this approach by Martin and Leslie Henderson from 2019, that was a really great initiative. And I personally think it should be extended. They set up a crowdsourced inventory of factoids and myths on plastic pollution, and everybody could go there and enter the myth or the claim and then fact check it. And I mean, it's really interesting. I think maybe Eli, can you put in the link into the chat window maybe? And I recommend everybody to go there and read it, because in the end, you know, it's really interesting how shaky many of those figures are. And next, I'd like to do another little poll with you. So at what time do you think was ocean plastic pollution reported in the media? Was it around 100 years ago, 50 years ago, 30 years ago, or 10 years ago? Let's see the results. 50 years ago. You're all pretty informed. That's, from what I know, probably the first mentions too. Somebody said 100 years ago. Maybe we will find something from, well, maybe some Bakelite. Right, yeah, I think Bakelite was found. But I don't know if it was reported in the media. 30 years ago, 10 years ago. Okay, so here's an article from the New York Times from 1972. Plastic is found in the Sargasso Sea by Boyce Rensberger, who was a science journalist at the time at the Times. And you can still find it in the archive. And it's referring to 2 science pieces, 2 science papers that came out that very same year, where Ed Carpenter and his colleagues had found plastics on the Sargasso Sea surface, so in the North Atlantic, in the middle of the ocean, and later on also in coastal waters. And what's remarkable about this article and the papers is that so much of what we talk about today, the microplastics, the plastosphere, the chemicals, the gyres, that's all already in there, though it's not called by those names. And I thought that was really remarkable when I heard about that. Here's another one. This is Hans van Venen on the lower and upper left. He's actually the guy who made me think about this history of plastic pollution research. And on top, you see this article that came out in a Dutch local newspaper at the time that tells about his findings of these little pellets that we hold in our hands on the right-hand side. So the jar on the left is from, I think, from 1974 or so. He collected them. And you see they're quite different from the ones he collected later on. And if you translate the title and the subtitle, white pellets on the floodline, I think it says, trash from the industry is spreading over the world oceans. That's really remarkable to read that from almost 50 years ago or from 45 years ago. So why is there this big attention now? You know, I'm not the only one who followed that. There's a really great article by Stephen Burangi, The Plastic Backlash in The Guardian. He interviewed all these people from Greenpeace and scientists, really important scientists, and they all said the same thing. We're getting all these interview requests. We're getting all this resonance. We never had so much coming back on a topic, and they're really all like struck by all the sudden attention. So one way to explain that could be to say it's just an issue of accumulation. More and more plastic production led to more and more waste, and then more and more waste escaped to sea as well. And then, you know, this is noticed, and there's a rise in scientific publications on marine litter, and then also on other kinds of plastic pollution issues. And then the question is, where does the media come in? Is that like, is the media reporting before the science or after the science? This is another interesting way of looking at it. It's by Chris Rose. He's a campaigner. He's been working for big environmental organizations. And on his blog, he wrote a post called, I have to look at it, Why We Suddenly Have a Plastic Crisis. And his idea is that we have two tracks for an environmental topic to be on. The slow track, which is the track of, you know, the experts, the pundits, the people who really think about these things in their complexity, and then talk about it in their specialist language and publish in their special journals and so forth. And then the fast track, which is like the threshold of attention for the general public. And the interesting thing is that he thinks that there could have been a moment in 1970 when actually this topic could have risen to the surface much more. And he thinks it was Thor Heyerdahl who could have been the one to bring it to attention. He was this adventurer, if you don't know him, who built these old drafts to show that people were able to go from one side of the ocean to the other, and then he went on these adventures, and people followed it, maybe like people following Greta Thunberg going over the Atlantic. And on one of these trips, he saw oil pollution, but also waste plastics. And he reported that to the United Nations. But in the end, oil was actioned and not plastic. And then plastic just fell down to the slow track again. And his thought about that is that it could have been an oil tanker disaster that was close by in time that focused attention on oil pollution. And Rose says that it's these charismatic figures that really bring it up to this level. So in his idea, it was then Charles Moore who reported about the plastic soup in the Pacific Gyre. And then that drew it up to the fast track. And then all the scientists who came after, Richard Thompson, Brown, and all these others, they basically added more and more knowledge and kept it up there. And it's interesting because from then on, the two tracks have merged. So plastic is on the fast track. Here are some recent headlines, or relatively recent from the past year. And you can see, you know, what makes the news: the spikes during the pandemic, the highest plastic, the plastic in the most intimate place, the placentas of unborn babies, the flashy ocean cleanup sunglasses, and a deep sea crustacean called Erythenes plasticus. Some big organizations also made the topic a focus of their work. So for me, a really crucial year was 2018, when the UN Environment Day was dedicated to the motto, "Beat Plastic Pollution." And they made this rather funny service announcement with this woman trying to break up with plastics. And at the same time, the National Geographic started what they called a multi-year campaign on plastic pollution. And they're really interesting because they have become, I think, a hybrid of science funders, storytellers, journalists, and also activists in a sense, because I think this claim, planet or plastic, is already quite activist, right? It's either or. With this rise in attention, there has been also a public debate, an academic debate, whether plastic pollution maybe has become a hype, or maybe a distraction from more important threats to the oceans, or environmental threats in general, like climate change. And, you know, this is not the only such debate. There are others, but this one, you know, it goes, you know, viewpoint and then counterpoint and so forth. This is from 2019. And 2019, if you look at Google Trends, it's really hard to see, but here, this is 2019, seems to be really the peak of plastic attention, peak plastic, so to say, peak plastic pollution in public interest, because these are the amounts of searches done on Google. And so when I pulled that up today, I was really surprised that we actually see the curve going down again. So maybe we have reached peak plastic attention. And then the other thing is, does plastic pollution as a topic overshadow climate change? And I mean, Google Trends is just like a little bit of an indicator, but if you look at Google Trends, definitely this rise in attention of plastic pollution, which is the red line here, is tiny compared to the overall interest in climate change. There's also been now papers on public understanding of plastic pollution and the role the media plays in that. And the media seems to play a very big role, just like it played for me and maybe for many others like you who learned about it in the media. And then also media critique in terms of how is risk understood in the media versus in the science? How is it framed? And I think that's a really interesting research area, because plastic pollution could become like an exemplary, like an example for how science communication, how, you know, there's this gap in the communication, this possible gap. But I think we would need a really big data set for that. So, and also consider like that journalists don't talk to papers, journalists talk to people. And so there's like something in the middle. You can't just compare the paper with the media report. You also have to think, did this journalist talk to someone? Who did he or she talk to? And then maybe you can see the transcript, or even listen even to how people said things, because that's also obviously what we're picking up when we're doing our reporting. Another thing that I think is really important to know when you wonder, like, how does the news come about? Why is it done the way it is? I think that the precarious working conditions in journalism, I'm not sure if they're as well known. I think they're probably well known, but they're really precarious. And so here are just a couple of aspects of that precarity. I mean, especially for freelancers in terms of pay, it's like a report by report where you're paid by in lines or in time, so in length, basically, not necessarily in quality, and you know, social securities and all, that's all a big issue. Often journalists are generalists, so they report on a variety of issues. They have a really high responsibility towards the public, the editors, and their interviewees. So they're basically sandwiched somewhere in the middle. There's a really high pressure to reach quality and perform well. And I think most journalists I know, they really want to get it right. But also, we're not always in charge. Like oftentimes we authors are not in charge of the title, the teasers, or the images, or the text below the images. And so, you know, those are really important parts of an article because many people only read that. And personally, I think that's really something that we should change in the system, that authors who have spoken to the sources actually can make sure that all of that is correct before we let it out. And then oftentimes, just because of the pay, we need to produce lots in little time to make a living, need to sell one story several times to make ends meet, and we can't really afford to drop a story. And I think that is a really important thing. You know, if you find out that this is not really a story, but you've invested so much time and you're being paid not much, then can you afford to say, oh, okay, I'm not going to do it? Here's an alternative approach, or a different approach. And I think it doesn't apply to all of media, because obviously we need fast moving media, especially in a crisis like now, in a pandemic. But for other fields, less could be more. And I really like the Slow Media Manifesto that's already 11 years old by a couple of people here in Germany. And they proposed this different system. A media that contributes to sustainability in production and consumption, focuses on quality, not necessarily the news, is distributed via recommendations, not advertising, promotes monotasking, is timeless and authentic, so it feels special. It's social, discursive, dialogic, and it respects the users. And it also asks for confidence to take time and be credible. Another really interesting concept for me was given to me by a friend from the Riff Reporter cooperative that I'm part of. He told me about this article by Konstantin Seibt here in the Tagesanzeiger. Die letzte exklusive Ware im Journalismus ist komprimierte Zeit. So that means the last exclusive good in journalism is compressed time. And what does that mean? Compressed time means that the more time you invest into a text or a podcast or anything, any media communication product, and the better you do that research, the faster the people who consume it can actually get that time from you. So you invested maybe, let's say, 1 day to write that article. Then the reader takes 5 minutes to read that article. He had 1 day and 5 minutes. But let's say you invested half a year or 10 years to make that film. Then the viewer gets like 10 years in 1 hour. So that's the idea of compressed time. And I really love that. The problem is that compressed time is not paid for in journalism. So that's a problem. I see narrative podcasting as slow media, or the way I do it. You might have listened to Plastosphere. These are the episodes, 10 episodes that I put out in 2 years. And I think I'd like to be a little faster as a slow media slownalist. But it's really a question of funding that, you know, I couldn't have done twice as much. I think it would have been possible, but I just don't have the budget. So I have to do other things to make a living. And yeah, it's just not possible. But thanks to all the Patreons and Riff Reporter supporters at this point who have given me small micropayments, and they really help because they really help me to keep the podcast online, because that also costs money, and to pay for the music licenses and so forth. So thank you. So here's my utopian conclusion. Maybe we need slow media, slow science, so plastic. So you could also see it as a verb. Maybe we need to slow media, slow science, and slow plastic. And that's not meant as in lazy or passive, but as in considerate and meaningful and measured. But as I already mentioned, the tricky question remains, how do we change the system to start new slow economies where they make sense, where faster isn't better anymore? Faster, more colorful, more clickbaity. How can we create the incentives and find the budget to do this? And I think that applies to, yeah, all of our fields probably. Yeah, so that was my input. Thank you very much.